That's a lot of damage.
Yeah, my grandmother died, so I didn't go to sleep.
Sorry for your loss.
Thank you. Painful loss.
I know how hard it is to lose a family member. Trust me.
My message. You're looking at a blur. That's Hale Center. Several of the schools are out today, so this is recorded. I'm going to use a set of notes that you don't have, but you have the same material. If anybody wants a set of notes, the reason I don't give it to you is it's really, really long, and it repeats a lot of stuff that we've already covered. Anybody have any trouble? Did anybody look at Unit 9? Any of you guys have? How about Unit 8? Did any of you have trouble opening the notes? Some people had trouble opening the notes. If you have trouble opening notes, I mean, the quizzes are still up, so you can still take them.
Professor Hunt, we cannot see you.
You can't see me? That's terrible. Can you see me now? What a delay. Can you see the screen in the back of the room? I can wave at myself. Other time, the screen in the back of the room waves back at me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Is anybody out there
We can
besides
see you.
Hale Center? Yes, good. Oh, thank you. Good morning. How about Tahoka? Is Tahoka out? Abernathy took the day off. They're giving himself a super holiday. You okay?
Golden.
You look like you're bleeding from the eyes. Hope it's not contagious. Okay. We left off, we were talking about steps, working our way up to the Civil War. So, let's get back into that. Can you remember the steps that we've named so far? First one was the Wilmot Proviso. Second one was, anybody? Hello? Earth calling Lubbock. Second step was the Compromise of 1850, where they broke up that big bill into little pieces to determine whether or not how the Western territories would be settled, to temporarily settle the fight over whether or not to have slavery out there and that sort of thing. That's not going to work very well, is it?
Fine. I started it at like 1 o'clock last night.
We have this today, what the?
Somebody's microphone is on. Wow, there's Tahoka. Good morning, Tahoka. Good morning, Tahoka. Turn your mic off. I don't want to hear my voice twice. Hearing it once is bad enough.
Mr. Hunt, this is Coach Overstreet. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Coach.
Hey, we have at some point today, we have our school-wide day of service for Thanksgiving.
Uh-huh.
So we might jet out of here about 8:40.
Okay, if you go, you go. This is recorded, so you can always go back and look at it.
Okay, so if you see us disappear today, that's why.
It won't hurt my feelings.
Thank you,
As
sir.
long as you reappear at some time, someday.
What'd you say?
I said, as long as you reappear at some time, someday. I don't want you to disappear forever.
We'll think about it.
Okay, that's very kind of you. Coach, walk over and whack her alongside the head. You have my permission. Is that called cruelty to students? I'm in favor of cruelty to students. Oh, jeez. Isn't that terrible? You guys don't know how good you've got it. When I was in school, the teacher could throw an eraser at you, throw chalk at you. I had one teacher that walked around stomping on people's feet if they didn't sit up straight. There'd be a lot of broken feet nowadays. Bear with me here. There we go. I've got it now. The computer hates this file because it's too long. And sending it through Blackboard is a real trial. You have to sit there and watch it load for about 30 minutes. Come on, come on, come on. 90%. There we go. This used to be narrated, so you'll see strange things in it. If I turn the slideshow on, I don't know if the narration's still there or not. I did this. Hang on for a sec. Come on, computer. Come alive. Oh, a wonderful person turned something off that wasn't supposed to be turned off. Ta-da! There we go in Technicolor. This is a year or so ago when I made this thing, and my friend flew into the room. I can't remember if his little friends followed him, but as I recall, a bunch of dogs came running into the room after that. We don't need to worry about it. Wilmot Proviso was the first step we were talking about. That happened before the election of 1848. After we get the election of 1848, we're settling what happens to the Western Territories. We have the Compromise of 1850. We talked that to death. Fugitive Slave Act caused a lot of trouble in the North. Then we talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Beecher family. Catherine Beecher, big on women's rights, but she believed that women should stay in the home. The other women that advocated women's rights didn't feel that way. Harriet Beecher, of course, is the author of the third step. The Democratic Convention in 1852 ended up with a kind of a dark horse candidate named Franklin Pierce, to many people's regret. and he's gonna win the election. There's another party called the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. They're not gonna get any votes to speak of, and Franklin Pierce becomes the 14th President of the United States, our only president from New Hampshire. He was a doughface. That meant he was a Democrat who was sympathetic to the slave-owning South. He oversaw the Gadsden Purchase. Where is it? There it is. That little sliver that now includes Tucson, Yuma, Gila. Gila's not even on this map. And a little hunk of southern New Mexico. He's going to get involved in the Austin Manifesto, where they're trying to figure out a strategy for the U.S. getting Cuba. Caused great embarrassment to the United States. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We ended talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the fact that the South tended to support it. Some Northerners supported it because they wanted it to build a railroad. Some Northerners thought other things. Franklin Pierce supported it because he was a doughface. Stephen Douglas supported it because of the railroad. But mainly the support came from the South. The opponents were mainly people from the North because they thought that there shouldn't be popular sovereignty or anything else. They thought that there just shouldn't be any slavery, period. Charles Sumner, William Seward, Salmon Chase, all Northern senators, Thomas Hart Benton. And then one person of interest at the very bottom of that pile of opponents to the Kansas-Nebraska Act was Sam Houston, arguably the father of Texas. And Sam Houston had spent most of his life trying to bring Texas into the Union, and he could see this spoiling it all. So he opposed it to the bitter end. That's the territory we're talking about. On this map, it's marked as Nebraska territory and Kansas territory, but at that time it was all considered Kansas territory. And of course, this act is going to split Kansas territory into Kansas and Nebraska at 37 degrees. It's going to get rid of that Missouri Compromise, remember 3630 and all of that. It's going to repeal that, and it's going to institute popular sovereignty in all the western regions. What is so funny? You off your meds this morning? Okay. This is going to cause violence while people fight to see who's in control. The pro-slavery or the pro-free state people. John Brown shows up there. We'll talk about John Brown in a minute. In October of 1855, there are a number of wars. The city of Lawrence, which wasn't much of a city, was sacked by the pro-slavery people. They found a little cannon and started shooting at the city and burned down the city's only hotel, destroyed the city's only printing presses, 2 of them. In response to that, John Brown is going to launch the Potawatomi Massacre, where he just marches onto somebody's farm and hacks, because they're pro-slavery people, he hacks them to death, he and his sons and some of their friends. We get a territorial governor in there named John Geary, but the president's going to fire him because Geary tries to restore order, and he doesn't do it the way that the president likes. We haven't really talked about the next president. We'll get to that in a second. There's John Brown, born up in Connecticut in 1800, hanged in Charlestown, Virginia in 1859. Apparently someone didn't like some of the things he did, even though he was an abolitionist. There's the romantic view of John Brown, looking like an avenging angel. There's nothing wrong with his cause. There was just a little bit of wrong with his methodology. Usually you don't try political persuasion by chopping people up. There's the Beecher's Bible. This, I'm sure, will be on the final exam. It's a very important thing. What's the Beecher's Bible? Well, Henry Ward Beecher was a preacher, right? He was part of that Beecher family. A bunch of boxes marked Bibles started arriving down in Kansas territory, and if you opened the boxes, you discovered there weren't any Bibles in there. There were Sharps rifles in there, for the anti-slavery people to defend themselves. Sharp's rifle was fairly famous. I think buffalo hunters used it. But they started calling them Beecher's Bibles. How many pages in the Beecher's Bible? There are no pages in the Beecher's Bible. There's the Beecher family again. It starts out with border ruffians coming into the state in 1854, all pro-slavery, trying to set up a phony vote to make the state pro-slave. They're going to try again later on the same year. Finally, free soilers will also get there, and they'll try and set up a free state instead. President Pierce apparently doesn't like the free soilers and condemns them. Congress doesn't accept the pro-slavery voting. Slightly irregular. Yeah, you've got 1,600 people registered and there's 6,000 votes cast. I guess that's a little bit irregular. Pro-slavers attack Lawrence, burn the Free State Hotel, destroy 2 print shops, burn and loot homes. And then John Brown comes and launches his Potawatomi massacre. The president finally sends in troops in 1856. We'll talk about the constitutions. In the middle of all of this mess, in 1854, ex-Whigs, Free Soilers, a whole bunch of other splinter groups are going to get together. They're going to form their own political party to make it stronger than the previous ones, like the Liberty Party. And they name themselves the Republicans in homage to Thomas Jefferson. They have their first party convention in 1854 in Jackson, Michigan. In 1856, they will nominate John C. Fremont, that kind of self-advertising guy from the Mexican-American War. They'll nominate him for president. There are some of the constitutions that were submitted by Kansas Territory. It took 4 tries before Congress accepted one. The Topeka Constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, which Congress threw in the trash, the Leavenworth Constitution, which the President threw in the trash, and finally the Wyandotte Constitution, which was accepted. So Kansas won't get into the Union until January of 1861, but eventually they will get into the Union as a free state. Remember that. That might be a test question. Violence continues all through this period of time. There's an incident called the caning of Charles Sumner in 1856. He said some bad things about some of the pro-slave senators. And one of the pro-slave senators had a nephew who was a member of the House of Representatives. And he came and beat Charles Sumner almost to death on the floor of the Senate. That's a little bit disgraceful. Charles Sumner took a year and a half to recover. Preston Brooks got kicked out of the House of Representatives, went home, they held a special election, they re-elected him, and he went back. One of the local cartoons against the slavery people, that's apparently the Democrats trying to force slavery on the Free Soilers, according to that cartoon. The Republican Party convention in 1856, let's talk about that. They're going to nominate John C. Fremont. That's enough about them. The American Party are going to nominate former President Fillmore. Probably a good choice. Unfortunately, he didn't have the support he needed to win. The Democratic Party, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania wants to be it. Franklin Pierce, the president, wants to be it. Stephen Douglas, the senator, wants to be the president, and Lewis Castile wants to be the president. After a lot of debates, 17 ballots, they're going to pick James Buchanan, a pro-slave Pennsylvanian. That's really unusual because the majority of the people in Pennsylvania were against slavery, and more and more strongly as the days went by. The election of 1856, and we'll put Buchanan against John C. Fremont against Millard Fillmore. Buchanan's going to win, pretty big. So the Democrats are in the saddle now. Buchanan is a pro-slavery man. And he insisted, nobody mistreats their slaves, that would be stupid. That'd be mistreating your own property. Who got the idea that slaves are mistreated? You know, enough about Buchanan. Step 6, the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave. He was owned by a military officer. He was his, you don't call him an aide. The old military slang was your Batman, the guy that took care of all your stuff. And he went wherever that officer would go. In this case, he was a slave. Not always a slave. A lot of times, just a junior enlisted man. They went into a non-slave state. Were stationed there for a while. So technically, Dred Scott was a free man. And then they went back into a slave state. And his owner died. And his owner's brother inherited him. And his owner's brother suggested to Dred Scott, let's strike a blow against slavery. Why don't you sue me? He told Dred Scott, sue for his freedom, because you were in a free state. And they brought it to court in Missouri, and of course Missouri was a slave state, so they lost there. Then it went into federal court, and it bounced all the way up to the Supreme Court. Can anybody remember who the Chief Justice of the United States was? He was the guy that took all the money out of the National Bank and put it in the Fed banks on behalf of Andrew Jackson. And so Jackson made him Chief Justice of the United States. His name was Roger B. Taney. I'm digging through notes looking for numbers and things like that. So now we've got Buchanan in office. Bleeding Kansas is still going on. The Dred Scott ruling was that Dred Scott didn't have the right to sue anybody because he was a slave. And what the Dred Scott ruling said, first of all, any person descended from Africans, whether slave or free, is not a citizen of the United States. According to the Declaration of Independence. I'm not sure where I can find that in the Declaration of Independence, but that's what the Supreme Court said. They also threw out the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that denied the right to bring slaves up north of the Ohio River. And they also threw out the Missouri Compromise, which made it illegal to bring slaves north of 3630, which was kind of stupid because the Missouri Compromise had already been repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This infuriated the people in the North. Remember, they're already really, really angry because of the Compromise of 1850 setting up the fugitive slave law. Now they're even more angry. And it'll get worse. The Panic of 1857. We had inflation. It was one of those sad things. We had a financial panic because we had too much gold. How can that be? We had so much gold that the value of gold went down, and our money was based on gold. So it caused big companies to fail, railroads went broke, and the government's going to have to spend money they don't have. There's runs on a lot of the small banks. That's where everybody wants their money out, and no bank ever has all the money that's deposited. Why? Why, if everyone, let's think of a bank. You pick your bank in Lubbock. If everyone that had money on deposit in that bank went to the bank on the same day and asked for their money in cash, why would the bank not have that money? No idea? How do banks make their money? They loan it. So a lot of that money still belongs to them, more or less, but it's loaned out. And a lot of the banks didn't keep enough reserves. And when people needed money in a hurry, it would be everybody, but when a large number of people wanted money, they would have problems. The National Bank solved that problem, but of course Andrew Jackson got rid of it. That's step number 7. Now, step number 7 also made the people in the North angry. So we've got 3 events, one after another, that have made the Northerners mad. The reason the people in the North were mad about this big bank collapse thing was the South didn't have banks. All the South had was slaves and cotton and some tobacco. So when this big bank panic happened, nobody cared. But the North really suffered from it. And they were resentful that the South had slaves. That gave them another reason for not wanting the South to have slaves. About this time, Abraham Lincoln makes a really, really famous speech, one of his most famous before he became president, called the House Divided speech. He made it in 1858. He was getting ready to run for senator in Illinois. And he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. He said, I don't expect the Union to be dissolved. I don't expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided. And basically he went on to say, either this whole country is going to have slaves, or this whole country is not going to have slaves. And of course he was right. Step number 8, during this campaign for election to senator, 1858. Abraham Lincoln's running to take the seat away from Senator Douglas. Douglas is a much better debater. They go all over the state. Yeah. You wouldn't really, it's difficult in our time. I mean, we've got Twitter and all that stuff. But back then, they didn't even have loudspeakers or anything. So if you went and made speeches, if you had debates, you had to go to different localities, stand on the back of a wagon, stand up on a stump or whatever, and the only people that you affected were the ones that could hear you. Or you could wait a couple months later when it all got published in the newspapers. And Douglas wasn't smarter, but Douglas had a really good voice, and he was used to this sort of thing in the Senate. And so he won, or he seemed to win, almost everywhere. But I will tell you that Abraham Lincoln, in my opinion anyway, was probably one of the most brilliant politicians, if not the most brilliant politician in the history of the United States. He understood people, and he understood law, and he understood debating. The only problem was he was kind of tall, gawky looking, didn't have a really great voice. So if you're talking about like a TV star looking appearance, he's going to lose every time. But finally, in the last debate, they were in a place called Freeport, Illinois, and Abraham Lincoln corners Stephen A. Douglas. You see, there were 2 issues that were very much on the minds of people. One was the Dred Scott decision, where basically the Supreme Court said that African Americans have no say and no one can forbid slavery anywhere. And the doctrine of popular sovereignty. And at one time or another, Stephen A. Douglas had said he supported the Dred Scott decision and he also supported popular sovereignty. And Abraham Lincoln said, but the Dred Scott decision disagrees with popular sovereignty. So how do you explain that you support both of them? And he caught Douglas off guard. And Douglas kind of stuttered around and made this convoluted this speech about, well, he supported the Dred Scott decision, but the people didn't have to vote to support slavery or something silly like that. And what he did was, the people around him probably didn't understand what he was saying. But the newspaper people did. But it's going to be a delay for this to get in the news. Stephen Douglas, for all intents and purposes, wins the debate. and he's gonna win the election back into the Senate. But the long-term effect, after this stuff is put in print by the newspapers, it's gonna cause him to lose the presidency in 1860, when he runs for president, because it's all gonna come home to roost. That's step number 8. Are we ready for John Brown to come back? And the return of John Brown. Harper's Ferry. Back then, Harper's Ferry was in Virginia, now it's West Virginia. There was a federal arsenal on the south side of the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry. That's a pretty place if you ever get a chance to go there. John Brown decided to take a bunch of his friends and his sons with him, and they were going to go down to Harper's Ferry, down in the heart of Virginia. They were going to raid the federal arsenal there. They were going to take out all the guns, and they were going to start distributing them to all the slaves they could find, and they were going to start a giant slave insurrection, which they expected to spread all over the South. You'd never guess who blew the whistle on them. It was an African American who said, these guys are crazy. They're going to get a lot of people killed. Went to the authorities, reported it. Word got back to President Buchanan. While he was a pro-slave kind of guy, he didn't think what John Brown was doing was by any means legal. If you attack a federal arsenal, that's treason. He looked around for someone to go down and solve the situation quick before it got to be a really big situation. He found a young Army officer by the name of Robert E. Lee. He was a colonel, he was an artillery officer. And he said, go down there and clean this up before we have mayhem in the South. Robert E. Lee didn't have any army around him, so he went to the Navy Yard. He got a whole bunch of Marines, put them on a train, and they went down to Harper's Ferry. And the first thing they did, to keep from having a massive war down there, they told all the local militiamen who were trying to attack John Brown, go home. This is not your business. This is the job of the federal government. Go home. Put your guns away. Then he went to John Brown, who was forted up in the arsenal or nearby. They'd already been fighting with the local militia a little bit. And he told John Brown to surrender, and John Brown said, never. And eventually they take John Brown by force. He's wounded. I think a young Marine lieutenant ran him through with a sword. They hauled him off to Charlestown, which was in the western part of the state of Virginia, and now, of course, it's part of West Virginia. They put him on trial for treason. They convicted him, and they hanged him. Let's talk about how people lined up around the John Brown issue. Abraham Lincoln thought John Brown was wrong, and what he did. Who else thought he was wrong? Stephen A. Douglas, escaped slave, thought he was wrong. John Brown tried to get Harriet Tubman to cooperate with him. She wouldn't. That's not the way you do things. Ralph Waldo Emerson, David Thoreau, the Transcendentalists, thought John Brown was a saint. Wrote poems about him. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the leading abolitionists, criticized Brown's action. Walt Whitman wrote a poem about him, glorifying him. Doesn't matter, he was still hanged. Let's get rid of that narration there. These abolitionists on this list here were the people who financially backed John Brown, secretly. They called them the Secret Six. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Samuel Gridley Howe, Theodore Parker, the Transcendentalist, Franklin Sanborn, Gerrit Smith, the founder of the Liberty Party, George Luther Stearns. As soon as John Brown was convicted and hanged, these guys went, whoops, maybe they're going to come after us, because they were secretly financing him. So they all skedaddled. It's kind of funny. One stayed in the U.S., Thomas Higginson. 1, 2, 3 ran for Canada. One went all the way to Europe. Theodore Parker, and one checked into an insane asylum. They figured they wouldn't arrest him if he was in there. That's funny about people who are willing to let somebody else do their dirty work, and then they're afraid of taking responsibility for it. Okay. Those were 9 steps, and we're coming up to the 10th step. The Republican Convention of 1860. There was a guy from New York named William Seward. He was expected to win the Republican nomination. Very influential. Abraham Lincoln from Illinois was expected to be and also ran. He was popular. People were beginning to recognize his skills and things like that, but still he didn't have that much support. A fellow named Simon Cameron from Pennsylvania was one of the favored. Also Salmon Chase from Ohio. They voted several times. In the first vote, William Seward got 173.5 votes. One state split its votes. Abraham Lincoln got 102. Cameron got 50. They voted again. Seward got a few more votes, but so did Abraham Lincoln. He almost got up with Seward. A lot of the little guys started dropping out. On the third vote, Seward got 180 votes. Abraham Lincoln got 231. Still not enough to push him over the top. But on the fourth vote, Abraham Lincoln got 349 not electoral votes, but 349 state votes, and he wins the nomination. And his vice president will be Hannibal Hamlin of Missouri. They're going to run against the Democrats, and the Democratic Convention of 1860 was also pretty interesting, because Stephen A. Douglas was always considered to be the front runner, but when the Southerners said, "We want your promise that you will support the continued existence of slavery," Stephen A. Douglas wouldn't give his promise. And so a lot of the Deep South stood up and walked out of the Democratic Convention. It was being held down in Charleston, South Carolina. And a month or so later, the South, the Southern people of the Democratic Party, are going to meet up in Baltimore, Maryland. And they're going to put up their own candidate. So the Democrats now have 2 candidates. The mainstream Democrats, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, and what we'll call the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats. We're going to nominate John C. Breckinridge. And it's a confused election, but what the Democrats have done is split their vote in half between 2 men. And so Abraham Lincoln is going to win this election. Now, a number of states during the campaign, especially at the time just before the election, particularly South Carolina, said straight out that they wouldn't accept Abraham Lincoln as president no matter what. There we go, kind of nullification again, I guess. And so the same month, or about a month after Abraham Lincoln was elected, he's still the president-elect, Buchanan's still the president. South Carolina has a convention and votes to secede from the Union. There he is, Abraham Lincoln. Finally grew some facial hair. 16th President of the United States. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, called him the first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference between himself and myself, of the difference of color. Frederick Douglass was sold on Abraham Lincoln. Now, there's a lot of people down south that are afraid of what's happening. There's an effort to compromise, to keep what looks like is happening from happening. It's called the Crittenden Compromise. It happens in December of 1860. They aim to resolve secession of South Carolina, who already voted in favor of doing it, by dealing with the existence of slavery, and guaranteeing the southern states that they wouldn't lose their slaves, and extending the old Missouri Compromise that had been thrown out. But this didn't sell. And before Lincoln actually takes office on March the 4th, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas will all join South Carolina in announcing that they were seceding from the Union. President Buchanan said, "You can't do it, it's not legal, but I'm not going to do anything about it." Why was he president? He was a big mistake, is what he was. If you look at this map, that kind of sick-looking pink at the bottom of the map represents all the states that left the Union immediately, the first 7. In March, just before Lincoln became president, Senator William Seward and Representative Thomas Corwin submitted a possible amendment to the Constitution of the United States to shield, quote, domestic institutions, that's a euphemism for slavery, to make it impossible to pass an amendment to get rid of slavery. That actually passed through Congress and through the Senate, but the states wouldn't ratify it. Okay, here's the big picture. Here's how you predict who's going to win a war. Take a look at that chart. The kind of pink-colored stuff, that's what the Union has. The kind of blue-colored stuff, that's what the South has. Total population, the Union leads 2.5 to 1. Free male population, 4.4 to 1. Wealth produced, 3 to 1. Railroad mileage, 2.4 to 1. Railroad shipping tonnage, 9 to 1. Naval shipping tonnage, 25 to 1. The South didn't have a Navy. Factory production value, 10 to 1. Textile goods production, 14 to 1. Iron production, 15 to 1. Coal production, 38 to 1. Firearms production, 32 to 1. Farm acreage in the North was even more. They even had more draft animals. They even had more livestock. They had more wheat. They had more corn. The only thing the South had more of was cotton. You can't eat it, and you can't fight a war with it. And if the other side has a navy, so you can't go and sell it, it's worthless. Except for stuffing pillows. Let's learn some vocabulary. Habeas corpus. Anybody know what it is? Have a general idea? Basically, habeas corpus, there's a writ called habeas corpus. If someone is arrested, his lawyer can present a writ of habeas corpus to the court. And the court will order the arresting authorities to do 2 things. Bring the person you arrested out here where we can see him, number 1, and bring us the official formal charges against him. And if they don't have the formal charges against him, they've got to let him go. Doughface we've already talked about. That's a northerner that was sympathetic to the slave-owning South. Copperhead, a new term. Up in the North, during the war, people who supported the South, secretly or just morally or whatever, were called Copperheads. Big problem for Abraham Lincoln. Scalawag, in the South, Southern people who supported ending slavery were called Scalawags. And late, at the end of the war, carpetbaggers were people from the North who went down to take advantage of the defeated South at the end of the war. Of all those words, I think the habeas corpus, of course, is used on an almost daily basis. Carpetbagger is used a little bit. The other words have kind of faded away. Lincoln's cabinet. Lincoln was really, really smooth. All the guys that he'd beaten in the Republican convention, he gave them all jobs. That shut them up. Seward became Secretary of State. Cameron became Secretary of War. Treasury went to Chase. They won't hold those jobs all the way through the war necessarily. Seward will. Cameron's going to get fired pretty quickly. Chase will be promoted up into the Supreme Court. The South is going to form, we don't need the music. South forms a group called the Confederate States of America, the CSA. They're going to write their own constitution. They're going to have their own cabinet, their own president, vice president. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Secretary of War, is chosen to be the president of the CSA. The vice president will be Alexander Stephens of Georgia. They'll have a whole bunch of people holding the other positions. Why? Because there was a lot of attrition during the war. A lot of people quit. There was Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. Fortunately for the North, Jefferson Davis wasn't a very good president. That's the Confederate cabinet. We don't need to dwell with that. Some of the important Southerners were people like Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant. He was an engineer, went to West Point. So did Robert E. Lee. He was an artilleryman. He was a colonel. The President of the United States actually offered him the rank of general in the United States Army before Robert E. Lee made up his mind to serve the South. Beauregard's going to be the very first battle in the Civil War. Albert Sidney Johnson was arguably the most accomplished general in the South, but he's going to die pretty early in the war. Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, will be one of Robert E. Lee's best assistants, one of Lee's lieutenants. James Longstreet was also one of Lee's most important generals under Lee. Longstreet was an anti-slave guy, by the way. Why is he fighting for the South? He's fighting for the region, not for the idea of slavery. Joseph E. Johnson, another really important general in the South. We don't hear much about him. Okay, let's look at the first battle. A lot of things happened in those early days. Abraham Lincoln, after the first 7 states left the Union, and Lincoln takes office, he's going to try and expand the Army. With some success. There's a lot of U.S. military forts down in the South, and the states that are seceding from the Union are going to start trying to take over those forts. The first battle will be at Fort Sumter. It's a little island that you can reach. If the tide's out, you can reach it overland. In the middle of Charleston Harbor. They're totally isolated. They have no supplies unless a ship can come in with supplies. But the Southern Army already has taken over the Federal artillery that's at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, and they turn ships back that are trying to resupply this fort. And the Battle of Fort Sumter will take place on the 12th and 13th of April, where General Beauregard organizes artillery fire on Fort Sumter from all sides, from the north and from the south. And Fort Sumter pretty quickly uses up all their water supplies, all their ammunition and everything. and the commanding officer is forced to surrender. You notice the little number 1 in parentheses next to that, up on the slide there? That just means it's one of the things you ought to remember when we're talking about studying the Civil War. There's Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter. As soon as that battle's over, Lincoln calls for troops on April the 15th. 4 more states are going to start declaring their secession. Virginia in April, Arkansas in May, Tennessee in May, and North Carolina in May. So now you've got 11 states that have seceded. We've got a couple of minutes. Let's talk about some advantages. The South had sympathy from Europe's ruling class. They sent their kids over there to school and things like that, the higher levels of society. The South felt that they could fight a defensive war. All they had to do was fight until the North got tired of fighting, and then the North would leave them alone. And if they could drag it out long enough, maybe they could get Europe to intercede on their side because they owned all the cotton. They also had a lot of good military officers, all trained in the United States Military Academy, West Point. And they felt morally justified because the Union was forcing them to give up slavery. And the Union was forcing them to do things that they thought were illegal. But their weaknesses, trying to form a country, first of all, they all believed in states' rights. So trying to get them together and get them to do things was like herding cats. Their leader, Jefferson Davis, wasn't a particularly good leader. Their militia, their army was all volunteer, and some of them felt that they didn't have to follow orders. And some of them felt, well, I volunteered, so I can volunteer to go home too. And all they had to fight with was cotton. Their strategy, just keep fighting until the North gets tired. Seek a negotiated end to the war, allowing us to maintain slavery, etc., and ask our European friends to help us out. Northern advantages, manpower, they could purchase supplies overseas, they had more money, 3/4 of all the U.S. money was in the North, manufacturing, strong banking, they had 3/4 of all the U.S. railroads, standardized tracks. The South didn't have standardized tracks. They had the most facilities for repair and construction, and they controlled the sea because they had a navy. And the South didn't have a navy. So if you were, one of these prognosticators, and you looked at that in the chart I showed you a minute before, you could probably tell me who was going to win this war. And the question that's always bounced around in my mind is, a 10-year-old could figure that out. Why did we go to war? Then we'll probably never answer that, but before the dust settles, we will have killed somewhere in excess of 620,000 young men. What's our strategy going to be? The Union strategy: blockade the South with our Navy, get control of the Mississippi River, separate the South, subdivide the South, and go take their capital. And the war's going to be over. Sounds simple. It took a while. Okay. See you on Monday. Those of you who will be here, and if you're not here, I'm recording the class.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
So you can watch it that way. The Hoke is gone, Post is gone, Hill Center, you're stuck there because you got to eat. What do you get for breakfast, Hill Center? Nobody knows? Okay, see you next week.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.